PlexTrack is the platform that helps cybersecurity practitioners get the daily work done. Red teams can create reports in half the time and track risk to resolution with the blue team. Teams can centralize remediation efforts across all scans, assessments, and audits. Effectively communicate risk in real time through simple visualizations, scanner and ticketing integrations, and robust analytics. PlexTrack is perfect for collaboration across all teams. Visit securityweekly.com/PlexTrack to claim your free month. NetSpark are the developers of a comprehensive automated web security platform that includes web vulnerability scanning, assessment, and management. NetSparker's desktop and cloud-based security solutions employ a unique and dead-accurate vulnerability scanning engine that automatically verifies vulnerabilities and provides a proof of concept. For more information, visit them on the web at securityweekly.com/NetSparker. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. If you've missed any of our previous webcast or technical trainings, they're available for your viewing pleasure at securityweekly.com/on-demand. So make sure you check those out. With me for this segment is Lee Neely. Lee, welcome.
Good to be here, and great looking forward to our conversation with Qualys.
Absolutely. Mr. Tyler Robinson is here with us as well. Tyler, welcome.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Yes. It's really interesting. I've been using Linux and Unix computers for a really long time. I'm dating myself. It was the late 90s when one of my friends first showed me Linux, and I've been using the Pseudo utility for all of those years. And what's interesting is to update the Pseudo utility, you've got to use Pseudo to update it. But I mean, there's other ways to do that, of course, right? But in all of the years of using Pseudo, I was like, wait, where does Pseudo come from? Like, what are the history and origins of it? A command, arguably, if you're using Linux or maintaining Unix systems or Linux systems, you probably use every day, right? And I'm like, I never looked into like who wrote it, where it came from, or any of that stuff. So I thought that was really interesting. And then to see a vulnerability in it, I was like, wow, this is something I've used for so long and use all the time. And now there's a vulnerability in it. Like, we need to bring someone on to help us understand it, because all of us read the technical description and all of our collective heads hurt really bad. So like, we need to bring someone on and talk about it. Here with us today is a vulnerability researcher from Qualys who goes by the name of Wheel, who was part of the team that discovered the heap overflow vulnerability in Pseudo, dubbed Baron Samedit, CVE 2021-3156. Wheel, welcome to the show.
Hi, Paul. Hi, everybody.
Nice to have you on, Wheel. I guess the first and easier question, right, is how did this vulnerability get the name Baron Samedit, which I'm still saying incorrectly, I feel like, but where did the name come from?
Well, it's just a word play. Pseudo sounds like voodoo, and Baron Samedit is the name of the spirit in the voodoo religion, and it relates to the Pseudo edit utility. So just basically a simple word play.
Gotcha. I guess the most pressing question for me, and we had all kinds of crazy theories, Wheel, but how did you come across this vulnerability? Because it's not often that I go, hey, I'm kind of bored. I'm going to start going through the source code of the Pseudo utility. I mean, that sounds fun and all, but usually these are the pressing matters. So how'd you come about to kind of get interested in even to look at this particular piece of software?
Well, I'm speaking on the behalf of the Quality Security Advisory team. So in our team, we used to audit open security softwares, and especially the juicy one, as I said, which means the ones that are everywhere, almost everywhere. As you said earlier, Pseudo is like a tool that is on most Linux system, almost every Linux system. It's a specific binary because it has some special credentials. It's what we call the set user ID binary, which means that when you run it, actually the process runs with the root credentials, the full privileges credentials. So it's an interesting target because of these reasons, and it has some slight differences with the other set user ID binaries in the way that its source code is quite big, which means that the more you write code, the bigger tends to be the attack surface. And finally, it changes a lot compared to other setuid binaries, which means that the probability to introduce a new bug during each modification exists. I don't mean that this very probability is high with Sudo because the author, Todd Miller, is very, very good, but it's higher than if you don't write any new code at all. So it's a very, very good target for security researcher. And we didn't find it by luck. I mean, it's a manual audit we performed, and it took us approximately 2 months to perform the audits and write the exploits.
That's interesting. But just on a little bit of the history of Pseudo, you mentioned the current maintainer is also one of the original authors, Todd C. Miller. Is that true?
Todd Miller is here. I mean, I think he's the maintainer and the author for like 15 years. I don't know exactly because Pseudo is really old. I mean, I think the first release is from 1982, maybe.
Yeah, 86. Sorry, I just pulled up.
86,
yeah, 1986. Yeah.
So, but Todd Miller is maintaining and developing Sudo for like 15 or 20 years, maybe.
Wow.
I don't know.
And Todd was super collaborative with you and super helpful, right? And great to work with, from what I
yeah.
That's awesome. So describe for us, Wheel. I guess kind of first at a higher level, how this vulnerability kind of comes to light and allows for exploitation.
Well, we read the code, and sometimes we find a bug, and it's not easy to explain because it's quite a long and difficult process. But we try to have a general view of the project. It's a kind of top-down approach, and then a bottom-up approach by reading the low-level functions to find if there are bugs in the functions that are used everywhere. And finally, we found 2 bugs. Each one of them is not exploitable by itself, but the combination of the 2 bugs is exploitable. So it explains maybe why the vulnerability was in the wild for like 10 years prior the discovery. And it's, from a technical point of view, it's a kind of classic heap overflow, which means that to exploit this category of bugs, you generally try to modify the internal structure of the allocated chunks of memory. These chunks are allocated by a standard function called malloc. But nowadays, there are numerous security checks in malloc, so we tried something else and found 3 different ways to exploit the vulnerability. There are probably some other ways, but we didn't go further.
And you mentioned there was another utility kind of in the mix. Was it Pseudo edit? Is that what you said?
Yeah, Pseudo edit is a kind of alias for Sudo. When you run Sudo with Pseudo edit with some options, actually the code, the executed code, is the one of Sudo. But it changes some little things in the process, and this is what we used to reach the vulnerable code. Sorry.
I gotcha. Well, what were some of the processes in kind of stepping through the code? I mean, are you using mostly open source utilities and debuggers? Because I mean, the code is open source, right? So unlike in Windows where you have to reverse engineer, you have the luxury. Is it a luxury to have the source code, or is it kind of a curse as well?
We simply read the code. We don't really use any third-party software to help us during the audit. We read the code, try to identify the critical sections, and sometimes, depending on the project, we monitor the changes that are done by the authors and the contributors. And when we find something interesting, well, we just try to find an exploitation. But most of the time, we don't find anything, So.
Yeah, most of the time it sounds like a thankless task of just reading open source code Because that's not. I mean, it's not easy.
Yeah. It's not the sexiest job in IT, in computer science, But it's very interesting, and you often see the patterns that are used by developers, and when you identify problematic patterns, you try to find it in other sections, in other softwares, and sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's not. But most of the time we read the code, try to understand the code, try to understand the ideas behind the code. And sometimes there is a difference between what we see and what the idea was. And this is where we can find something.
Tyler, Lee, questions for Wheel?
So I had a question. Go ahead.
go ahead,
Go
Lee.
ahead, Tyler.
No,
All right, hold
I'll tell
on.
you, buddy.
Tyler and then Lee. How about that?
No, I was curious. So, with such a prevalent thing that goes back so far, I mean, there is a lot of, I guess, can you speak to some of the responsible disclosure? Because there's a lot of devices that are probably utilizing Pseudo and are probably not going to be able to be updated. Things like IoT or ICS devices. Thinking of a lot of different library packages that leverage Pseudo as part of their kind of OS stack. So from that standpoint, what was kind of the mindset behind just going ahead and releasing and starting to disclose this vulnerability?
Well, we try to do a responsible disclosure, which means we first contact the author of the project. We send him a draft of the advisory. Then we exchange some emails if he has some solutions, if he has some advices to fix the issue. Then, depending on the project and how the release process evolve, we contact a private mailing list where most of the Linux distros, FreeBSD, and so on are monitoring. Where we try to coordinate the release of the patches, and then all the Linux distributions and all the vendors are in the loop, so they synchronize with the author, with us, to finally find a date where we can publish our advisories while the patches are available. But obviously there might be some problems or some minor issues or whatever. For instance, I think that Apple is not in this mailing list, private mailing list. So the Sudo version of Apple was fixed or patched like a few days ago, maybe yesterday, I don't remember, while the other systems were patched long ago. And for IoT devices, well, it will depend on the companies that runs the devices. We can't help them on that.
Yeah, at some point, those downstream of this fix have the responsibility to fix it, right?
Yeah.
Lee?
So the question I had, I mean, I noticed, this is the, behavior change based on argv0, the name of the binary. I remember back when I was first starting in Unix back in the late 80s, well, it was even earlier than that, it was really common to have binaries that behave differently based on what they were called, but it seems like it's gone down. Is that still a source of potentially vulnerable behavior, or is that become less common?
I don't know if I understood correctly your question, but
for example,
yep.
If you
go ahead.
Call, what is it, the SSH binary, if you make a link to it called SFTP, it'll run as FTP.
Not anymore.
Berkeley R commands used to do that a lot.
Yeah, not anymore. You can't do that.
So I was just saying it because that seems like what did them in is they didn't properly handle the case where they were switching for a different argv0, and I just wondered if that was a common area for misconfiguration.
No, it's not a problem. Actually, the fact that we used sudoedit to exploit sudo is just a trick. It's not a general issue, a general problem you find in other softwares. It's very specific to this one.
One of the bugs seemed to be centered around being able to control the user arguments. Was it at the end, part of the fix, I should say, bounds checking some of those user arguments? Is that did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, sure. There was some issues with the user argument provided, and I didn't read in details the fixes by Todd Miller, but yeah, sure. Most of the time, yeah, the issue is clearly the user supplied arguments. So if you sanitize them, you get rid of the problem. But some other times you have some internal logic issues, and you have to fix them whatever the user provides, because you never know what the user will do.
Right.
So you have to fix the root problem.
And this, all of the open source versions of Pseudo, those run on, did you investigate which Unix operating systems in addition to Linux? Like, are they basically all based off of this open source Pseudo project?
Yeah, FreeBSD uses Pseudo. OpenBSD switched to a simpler utility some years ago named DoAs. I think maybe AIX. I don't know. Maybe AIX uses Pseudo as well, and maybe some other. I don't know.
What's the likelihood that this is just as exploitable as it is on Linux on a lot of these other Unix variants? Is it pretty likely in your assessment, Wheel?
Yeah. For instance, on macOS X, it was really easy to exploit the issue. macOS X doesn't provide a sudo edit utility, but you just had to create a link to sudo named sudo edit, and then you can trigger the vulnerabilities. So since the base code is the same on most of the distributions and most of the systems, well, you have some very high probability to exploit the bug easily.
How do people know if they got the fix? I know in your blog post you list some suggestions. Could you just kind of talk our audience through how you test if you have a vulnerable version?
Yeah, sure. If you simply type like sudo edit -s / depending on the error message, you know if you're vulnerable or not. For instance, if the error message is like sudo edit blah blah blah, you're vulnerable. And if the error message starts with another string, another word, you're not vulnerable. But the best way to know that is to check the Pseudo version you're using and see if this version embeds the patches.
Interesting. And you can be really any user on the system, right? Because obviously you don't have to be root, because you have to be able to run sudo.
Yeah. That's why it's quite a big vulnerability, because often the vulnerability allows a regular user, a user where some attached to someone physically, my user or your user on the system. It allows this kind of user to elevate root privileges. But this vulnerability is really nice because it allows any user, be it sudoer or not. You don't have to be part of the sudoer group or whatever. You can be a simple system user like nobody, like www data or whatever. And as soon as you can run the sudo binary, you can get the root privileges.
Wheel, did you look at how Linux containers are built? Because I hadn't gone back and checked. Do most Linux containers include the sudo binary, and how could this attack play into attacks against containerized Linux systems?
I can't say. I'm not very familiar with containers, Docker, Kubernetes, or whatever. I prefer not to say anything wrong.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I think it would help you if you were able to break out of a container and have regular user privileges. I think you typically find the sudo binary on the host system running container.
Sure, absolutely.
That could be very, very interesting. When you review the techniques, and you said there was 2 vulnerabilities that were chained together for this, I guess there's two questions. One is, do you think other people now will start digging into the Pseudo code to discover other vulnerabilities? And what do you think their level of success might be, being close to this particular source code?
Yeah, actually, it was a concern because we published the vulnerability on January the 26th, if I remember correctly. But on January the 10th or 11th, someone already published a Sudo audit, and we were like, now that this audit is published, many people might look at the Sudo vulnerability, at the Sudo binary, Sudo code, and find the same vulnerability we were trying to polish and publish. So we had to rush a little bit, because if someone finds this vulnerability before our publication and our coordination with the vendors and the distribution, he might exploit it in the wild, or sell it to an organization, or even do a non-responsible disclosure. So
did you in talking with people about this vulnerability, was there any evidence that anyone had any knowledge of this vulnerability prior to you and your team's discovery?
It's difficult to say. I don't have any information about usage in the wild. Maybe not. It's difficult to say. I don't know.
Are there using the two kind of vulnerabilities and those types of vulnerabilities? How easy or difficult is that to apply it to maybe other binaries on the Linux system? Do you think that either attackers and or maintainers of open source packages, are they paying attention to this and are able to apply it to their own projects?
No, I think it's very specific to Sudo. These two vulnerabilities are, well, if you find one, that may explain the fact that this vulnerability was not found for the last 10 years, because if you find just one of them, it's not exploitable, and you might discard it as non-important. And you just have to find these two very specific issues and combine them together to exploit the system. But I don't think that people will try to find these two vulnerabilities, these two kind of bugs in other binaries, because every binary is very specific, and sometimes you end up finding a heap overflow, a stack overflow, and this is the common ground between all these category of bugs. But in Sudo, well, it's very specific. You have to escape or avoid an escape of a specific character at the end of a string. Well, maybe it might give some ideas to some researchers, but I think you cannot apply the same reasoning, or the combine this bug with the other in any other binary, any other project.
That's fascinating. Do you think the discovery of these specific bugs, or even types of bugs, could be automated inside of some kind of source code checking tool? There's dozens and dozens of tools that check source code for vulnerabilities. I'm sure some of these were run against this code base and just never found them. Do you think this could be automated, or is this something that only a human being can find?
I don't know this kind of tools enough to be very assertive, but you have some tools like the fuzzers, which sends a huge amount of input, user-supplied strings or data with a kind of randomization. And when you instrument the code, meaning you monitor the code and the branch the code is taking when it receives this kind of data or this kind of data. When you use the fuzzers, you can find unexpected bugs, unexpected code. And maybe it might help finding this kind of bugs, but well, we found it manually, so obviously the fuzzers didn't find this kind of bugs on Sudo. But I'm pretty sure some tools can find similar bugs on other tools, on other softwares, I mean.
That's interesting. And you and your team found this just by reading the source code, right? You said you didn't use any kind of fancy tools. Like basically you had a code editor and you were reading the source code.
Yeah. We just read the code. Read the code and read the documentation, read the commit messages from the developers, and try to understand the architecture of the software. And you ingest the code, you ingest the documentation, and maybe one day you wake up and you have an idea. Or maybe one day you read at the line you already read like 10 times and you find an issue. That's the way we audit.
It makes me feel better because I read some of the code that you had already identified as being vulnerable a few times, and I still had trouble understanding it. So it sounds like you went through a similar process. Like sometimes you read the same code 10 times before you realize that there is some kind of vulnerability.
Yeah. You only see our report, so you might think that we just read the code and find the vulnerabilities and find the exploits, but it took us 2 months to to find the bug and write the exploits.
Wow.
I had a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Lee.
So I was wondering, when you disclose a vulnerability like this, is there any expectation that the person fixing the code will look elsewhere in the code for other non-related vulnerabilities, or do they just fix the problem at hand and call it a day?
Well, it will really depends on the maintainer. Well, the Todd Miller, the maintainer at Pseudo, is really good and really conscientious. So when you when you find the when we say to him, well, we found this, in a few hours only, he comes back with the solutions, with some propositions and some mitigations. So yeah, it will really depends on the project.
Okay. Is it hard to be taken legitimately or credibly? In other words, for people to believe you really did find a vulnerability when you're pointing something out, is that an issue or a challenge, or have you got enough of a reputation that they'll take you at face value, or you can, they know you'll back it up?
Yeah. Well, when we send an email to a maintainer of a project, a developer of a project, we often send him or them a draft of the advisory. So he can check that we did our work and that there is an issue in his code. So we don't really have this kind of problem. Maybe at the very beginning, but I'm not sure.
Was Todd like super impressed when you sent him this report?
I think he was happy, actually.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah.
Because it makes the software more secure. So at the end of the day, that's what is important.
That's the sign of a really good open source maintainer too. Yeah. And a good developer, right, is happy when people find bugs in their code, right? Yeah.
At least outwardly happy.
Yeah. When he logged off email that day, he was like, "Damn it." Yeah.
Well, you don't shoot the messenger.
No, certainly not, right? I mean, because it is your fault at the end of the day for introducing the bug. Mm-hmm. I really want to ask you like what else you're looking into, but you probably can't talk about it, right?
No, I can't say, but we are on something, and hopefully people will enjoy it as much as the Pseudo vulnerability. So stay tuned, please.
And it sounds like, Will, that it's not just like a random decision to go after like one project or another. When you started this interview, I thought it was really cool that this is a widely used binary for escalating privileges. There's a large code base, so there's a lot of attack surface. Are those like three really good rules to like where you and security researchers in general should focus on the hundreds of millions of lines of open source code that are out there?
Yeah, sure. It's a very good point. You can find a bug or a buffer overflow in a software that nobody uses. It's not very important, and it won't make the internet or Linux more secure. So we really have to focus on this kind of target. It makes the work really difficult because that hundreds of eyes already saw the same lines of code than you, but you have to do this job.
Will, are there tips for developers to not introduce these types of bugs, or like I kind of feel like this is going to happen regardless of how diligent you are as a developer? No.
Yeah, it's very difficult because even Todd Miller may makes this kind of bugs, and he's a very talented developer. But the first, if I had one advice to a junior developer, it would be to check every return value of a function, because often when you are young and developer, you are a little bit lazy, and you don't check the return value of the functions, and when the function fails, you just ignore it and go to the next statement, and it's the biggest error, I think.
Yeah, that's a really great point. You tend to make assumptions, especially, internal functions. You're like, oh, I don't need to check that because it's coming back from code that is in this software project that either I wrote or someone else on the team wrote, right?
Absolutely. And you can see if you open the source code of any project, you will find these problems. It will not always end up with a vulnerability issue, a security issue, but you find it everywhere.
That's really interesting. Awesome. Well, any final questions for Wheel?
So I was thinking, you found one of the most common mistakes. Have you ever thought about producing a guide to help developers? It's like, really, you guys need to do these things, and they're not hard. Make my life easier or something,
Yeah, see. Well, we are security researchers, so we are paid to find issues and fix them. We could eventually write this kind of documentation, but it's a lot of work. And I think that the resources, the documentation is already available everywhere. But you have to look at the correct places. The main issues, the laziness, or the how would I say that? I don't know.
Sometimes is it laziness or time to market?
You just have to be lazy once to introduce a bug, but you know the rules already. You know that if someone tells you you have to do this and that, you already know that. So I don't know.
Yeah, I think we go through that as developers, right? We know deep down if we've taken a shortcut, but like Lee said, we have to either meet a deadline or just to get it to work, and we know we've taken shortcuts, and you don't often go back with the same level of scrutiny, Wheel, that you and your team are going through some of these projects. So
yeah. To go back to this question, there are already some resources for developers, especially on the CERT website. It's very complete, especially if you write C code. You have a lot of documentation, a lot of issues they often find in the wild, and it's always interesting. Even years after years of audit, I tend to take a look here and there, and it's always interesting.
Well, awesome. Will, this is great stuff. We're looking forward to see what you got coming up next, but I want to thank you for appearing on Paul Security Weekly.
Thank you.
With that, that will conclude this episode of Paul Security Weekly. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching. We'll see you next time. Over and out.